So continuing this conversation of filter context and filter flow, let's take a few minutes to dig into a slightly more advanced, slightly more complex topic called bidirectional filtering. So to explain what this is all about, we're going to look at that same simple three-table model here. The only difference is that in Power BI, we can update the cross-filter direction from single to both. That's why we see a two-way arrow shown here in the screenshot. And what that's going to do is allow filter context to flow in either direction. So we've been talking about these relationships, these filter wires, as one-way streets, where filter context can only flow in the direction of the arrow, but when you change the cross-filter direction to both, you're essentially turning it into a two-way street. And what that means is that in this example, if we apply filters to the sales data table, that filter context can now pass up to the territory lookup and then down to the returns table, which is something that wasn't possible before with only one-way filters. Now, there are a few ways that you can change the cross-filter direction. You can either use the Edit Relationship dialog box or the Properties pane. In either case, you should see a drop-down option that says Cross-Filter Direction, which you can change from single to both. Now, to really understand the implications of bidirectional filtering, let's return to the same example we showed in the last lesson and see exactly what impact this has. So here's our familiar three-table model, right? The only difference now is that we have a two-way cross-filter enabled between the sales data and the territory lookup tables. And by doing this, it means we can filter data from both sales and returns using the territory key from our lookup table, as we normally would, right? It's upstream and connected to both of those fact tables. But it also means that we can now correctly filter using territory key from the sales data table. Remember, the last time we did this, when we didn't have cross-filtering enabled, that filter context got trapped in the sales table, and we saw the same repeating values for return quantities. But this time, with cross-filtering enabled, that territory key filter context from the sales table is able to pass up to the territory lookup, back down to the returns data, and filter those return quantity values correctly. Now, if we tried to filter using territory key from the returns data, same story as before, because that filter between returns and territory lookup is still one way, that filter context gets trapped in the returns data table, and we see the repeating totals for order quantity. So hopefully that makes sense. Now let's look at this example, except this time we're going to put the two-way filter between returns and territory tables. So as you'd expect, as always, we can filter on territory key from our lookup, right? That's always going to be a valid filter state. And as you might expect, if we pull in territory key from sales, because that's now back to a one-way filter, that context gets trapped in the sales table, and we see the repeating totals for return quantity. Makes sense. But here's where things get interesting. Suppose we filter on territory key from the returns data table. Now, at first glance, everything looks great, right? We don't have any of those obvious repeating total values that indicate a relationship problem, so you might think that you're in the clear. But remember that territories 2 and 3 don't even exist in the returns data table because they didn't generate any returns. Because that's where we're setting the filter context in the returns data table, that context is passed to the territory lookup table and down to sales. And even though territories 2 and 3 generated orders, 40 orders for territory 2 and 30 orders for territory 3, they're completely stripped out of this view because our returns data table has no idea that those territories even exist. So to summarize, territories 2 and 3 don't exist in the returns table, so they aren't included in that filter context that eventually passes down to sales. Now, the reason I bring this up and the reason I walk through this demo is that you need to be extremely careful working with bidirectional filtering because it can lead to errors that are very tough to track or tough to spot with the naked eye, especially if you don't know your model inside and out. The other reason why I urge people to use bidirectional filters with an abundance of caution is that it can lead to something called ambiguity. And this typically happens when you have a model like this one containing multiple two-way filters. And what can happen is that these bidirectional filters can introduce multiple conflicting filter paths between tables. So you'll notice here that product lookup is connected to our returns table with an active relationship, and it's connected to our sales table with an inactive relationship. If we tried to activate that relationship between product and sales, we'd get an error message that sounds like this. It says you can't create a direct active relationship because that would introduce ambiguity between tables product lookup and territory lookup. So that message is a little bit vague, it's a little bit unclear, but what it's essentially saying is that if we had both of these relationships active, means we could pass filter context from the product lookup table through the returns table up to the territory lookup through that two-way filter, and we could also pass filter context from product lookup down through the sales table and back up to the territory lookup that way, because we have a bidirectional filter there as well. And the problem is that this could potentially create two different conflicting sets of filter context, both passing to the territory lookup table simultaneously. So let me try to give you an example here that's a bit more tangible, right? Imagine we're thinking about just one specific product, like a water bottle. Now imagine that that water bottle was only returned in territories 1 and 2, but it was sold in territories 1, 2, 3, and 4. When we filter on that product from the product lookup table and allow that context to pass through both the sales data and returns data tables, that means that our territory lookup would be receiving two different sets of filter context. The returns data table will be telling the territory lookup to filter down to territories 1 and 2. The sales data table would be telling the territory lookup to filter down to territories 1, 2, 3, and 4. And we can't pass conflicting filter context to the same table. That's exactly what we mean by ambiguity. So this is definitely a pretty nuanced topic, but the key takeaway here, my pro tip for you, is to always try to design your models with simple one-way filters and one-to-many cardinality, unless more complex relationships are absolutely necessary. There are some cases where bidirectional filters or different types of cardinality are required, but for the vast majority of models, one-way filters and one-to-many cardinality will get the job done. So last thing I want to do here is take these concepts that we've been talking about, bidirectional filtering and ambiguity, and show you what they look like inside of the Power BI environment. All right, so I'm back in the AdventureWorks report. I'm in the report view. And remember, we have our matrix here. What we were doing was showing the order quantity and return quantity by territory key using the territory key from the returns data table, which we can see by hovering over the field here. And because we're only using one-way filters right now, that filter context gets trapped in the return table, and we see the same repeated grand totals from our sales data table. Now let's jump into our model view. And what we're going to do is change the relationship between returns and territories. Let's actually scroll over so we can see it. There we go. Let's double click. And here in the edit relationship dialog box, we can change that cross filter direction to both. You can see the little arrow change from one direction to two directions. Now if we go back to our report view, watch what happens here. Now we don't see those repeating grand totals. These look to be completely accurate. But again, they're not, because we're missing those two territory keys, number 2 and 3, that never even existed in the return table. Now, if we head back to the model view, and suppose we wanted to make the relationship between sales and territory lookup bidirectional as well, we can do that also from our properties pane as well, right here in the cross filter direction dropdown. If we try to change that to both and apply the changes, watch what happens. We get an error. There are ambiguous paths between territory lookup and product lookup. And that's exactly what we had talked about, where by creating two bidirectional filters, we're creating the possibility for conflicting filter context to reach the same territory lookup table. So we have to close it. It won't even let us create that two-way relationship. And in this case, we really don't want any two-way relationships in our model. We don't need them. So let's go ahead and select this relationship between territory and returns. Go ahead, change that back to single, apply changes, and we should be right back to where we started. So there you have it. Hopefully that was a helpful overview of bidirectional filtering. Definitely a bit of a nuanced, complex topic, but the key takeaway here is that you should really only use these bidirectional filters when absolutely necessary, and when you do use them, be very, very careful about how they're applied.